Now, we're at that point in this first session and in our experiment here where things are going to loosen up a little bit. In order to ensure that all the questions are audible to both audiences, I'd like to ask our technicians at each location to turn up all the microphones at the locations in case they have not been to this point. Okay. Now again, to repeat, in order to enhance our sense of sort of person-to-person exchanges, and to aid both audiences' understanding of questions, we'll ask questioners to raise your hands, okay, and keep them raised for a few moments after they begin. After you begin your questions, keep your hand up so that the audience across the ocean will sort of get the right face and right mouth with the right sounds, and I think will therefore likely make the questions more comprehensible transatlantically. After all, the only thing that separates us is a common language, right? Okay, now, also generally, we're going to try to aim as much as possible to sort of alternate between each of the two locations. So, in effect, while someone is asking a question here at Emory, Harvey, I gather that you will be taking principal responsibility for sort of spotting the next questioner who will be arising from the Oxford audience.
That's
okay.
right.
Sorry. Okay. That said, we're ready to roll, and I suppose we'll, because there's always a little reluctance initially about this, maybe we'll just have to go with whatever hand comes up first in either location. Okay, we've got one. Yes. Camera angle, there you go. They'll hear you.
Okay,
Right ahead.
Robert Puckett with the American Academy of Religion here in Atlanta. My question is for Emma about your control experiment with Beth and the physical versus mental capabilities that are implicit in that dominant displacement mode. The idea being that the mind is displaced, but the body stays the same. I don't know about your specific field work, but cross-culturally in many ethnographic descriptions of possession experiences, the possessee does take on abnormal physical qualities as well as the abnormal kind of mental state. Things like pain tolerance, feats of strength and dexterity, excessive alcohol consumption way beyond the tolerance of the actual physical individual. If the displacement model that you posit through this control experiment holds cross-culturally, how do you explain this? Or is this some Cartesian legacy that your British and Irish students are holding on to that may not apply in other cultural contexts?
Thank you. That's an excellent point, actually, and I think that our experiment and the way it was set up possibly assumed a little bit of a Cartesian split in a way, because it's, well, in some way we decided what was mind and what was body in advance, and I'm actually conducting research currently to try and figure out people's categories with regard to themselves, so not using the word mind, but themselves and their bodies cross-culturally. So I've already done some research on that in Brazil and in the UK here with colleagues here in Oxford. You're absolutely right to point out that the possession can have these physical effects, and you know, we observed that in the ethnographic record a lot, and I observed it a lot in Brazil. What really struck me, though, was that perhaps, you know, we don't have rigorous, conclusive, you know, sort of systematic evidence on the issue of whether intuitive dualism, so not maybe a very sophisticated sort of Cartesian dualism, but some form of intuitive dualism is present cross-culturally. But what it seems to be in some way there implicitly within the Brazilian context, and the only evidence I have of that is that when possession occurs, when there's a mental transformation such that, for example, the person no longer remembers things that you might otherwise expect them to remember, and then they realize, oh, of course they're possessed, and so on, or they're behaving in ways that are generally considered to be driven by mental agency or intentional agency, and so on. If those change, it's not so dramatic as when physical behaviors change, such that the face the face looks older, or the whole body takes on, the appearance of an older person, should the spirit be of an old person, or that the body takes on the behaviors and kind of comportment in a way, the expression, facial expression and so on, looks like a child, should the spirit be a child, that they can do quite miraculous feats. I remember stories going around of very elderly arthritic women being possessed by spirits and sort of cartwheeling and dancing all night around the dancing arena. Those stories seemed to be more sort of stand out from the rest for people. And I wondered at the time, and I still need to do some research on this, as to whether the kind of possession by a mind as influencing mental events is more intuitive in a way than possession by a mind influencing physical events. And I think drunkenness and so on might fall in between, pain and so on. I have a few interesting stories about that. So this is something that I really want to follow up in the research. Could that have even a cognitive advantage in transmission, because it's minimally counterintuitive, and some people might be familiar with that term, but that it actually stands out because it violates some intuitive assumptions about the connection between mind and body. So I think you've raised a really important issue, and it's something I have thought about. It's not something that I incorporated into that particular study. It's something that I've thought about since then, and I'd like to follow up. But thank you.
Thanks, both Emma and Diane. I'm an anthropologist at Oxford's theology faculty, so I'm especially grateful for these kinds of interdisciplinary discussions, and it's really a question for you both, because I'm convinced by what both of you say about the power of looking for universals, if you will, in cognitive structure, and ensuring that through that approach and through those models, we don't hierarchize culture or peoples historically or in the contemporary world. At the same time, surely we don't want to let difference fall out of the equation, not in a hierarchical or an evolutionary perspective, but just in terms of a contemporary world full of different cultures, different religions, and the possible interplays between those two. And speaking of religious experience, of course, we can turn to Oxford's erstwhile professor of Indian religions, R.C. Zahner, and his wonderful work on mystical experience, by the end of which he's thoroughly convinced that mystical experience is not universally attained in the same model, but rather that in some cases you have union or transcendence, and in other cases, as in Otto's experience of the holy, for example, you might have an experience of smallness in the face of other. Similarly to Emma, I would say we don't always have models of religious experience that involve thought, but rather in some traditions we have a sublimation of thought or a transcendence of thought. There may be much more variation. So how can cognitive science help us not only toward an understanding of universals, which, as Diane's pointed out, is incredibly important politically, but also to comprehend difference in the way that anthropology does best, which is not just as a manifestation of the same cognitive elements in different ways, but really in some kind of interactive mode with cognitive processes.
If I might start, and then Diane, you can take over. I'll just start on the question about the cognitive science, and I think that I don't think it's actually accurate in a way. It might be somewhat of a misrepresentation to see cognitive science and the cognitive science of religion, so the kind of cognitive science that we borrow as anthropologists and even as psychologists working in a more sort of cross-cultural context, to suggest that that's only sort of probing for universals. I think that to a certain extent it's difficult. We could start by saying it's difficult to measure variation in a way if you have you don't really have a rod against which to measure it. But at the end of the day, all the theory that inspires cognitive research it assumes that cognition operates in context. Okay. Sometimes a lot of that context is stripped down when you want to get something like a very rigorous design and look at one factor in a laboratory setting. Okay. The whole point, I guess, of my research in a way is to kind of bring those two things together, where you have the kind of messy ethnographic context where it's difficult to see patterns and so on, and then the cognitive science stuff that comes from the lab, and actually see, can any of this explain some of what we see out here in certain, against certain contextual constraints. And so the idea is not just to look at the kind of ecology and environment in which ideas spread and the historical kind of trajectories of ideas, that's very important, and it's not to sideline that either, but it's to suggest how are they also constrained by the cognition as well. So in that way, it's the measuring rule, but in context. And so I'm definitely interested in both. And there's a lot of variability out there. You know, you could even look at language variation and how it impacts on the way in which people conceptualize their world and so on. But I think the message from cognitive science is that it's not a free-for-all. You know, it's not blank slate and so on. So it's kind of an antidote to that message, but still, I think, measured and interested in context and difference and variation.
The only thing that I would add to that right now, because I'm very new to this, is and I don't want to necessarily overstate the point, but I really see cognitive science as helping to liberate us from some of the ideological biases and frameworks that have guided certain kinds of questions and yielded certain kinds of results. And I'll speak, for example, right now just as a theologian. It's not that cognitive science can explain everything, for example, about enslaved Africans who participate in ring shout practices, ecstatic practices where they dance around in a ring and get possessed, and see that as the essence of religious experience, as it was reported in the diaries that these missionaries left. But it's that when I look at the literature, for example, in Black liberation theology, I'll just use that as an example, there's a certain kind of assumption that if these practices are persisting in Black religious experiences, they are in part persisting because of the impact of oppressive colonialist legacies on Black religious experience. And maybe cognitive science of religion, in helping us to understand some of the intuitive proclivities and theological sensibilities that might rest among the human family and might rest in particular ways in particular environments among certain groups, might free us from some of those ideological presuppositions. Cognitive science of religion might give us tools to see more subtle kinds of theological legacies in these traditions that we can't see right now because we're so our research and our theological reflection is so burdened by dominant dogmatic categories. And I'll think a perfect example is Christology. Many theologians in my field, my subfield in particular, read Christology as a dominant symbol in the religion of enslaved African Americans. And as I go back and look at primary records, I'm not seeing Christology as pronounced as it has been claimed. So in some ways, I'm at the stage where I just believe it can help to free us from all kinds of biases, ideological biases that drive the results that we might be determining from our research. Maybe I'm too hopeful about it, but I find it kind of refreshing at this point.
Okay, we thank you both. We're ready for another question from the Emory side, if indeed we have one. Yes, Bobby. Hand up, Bobby. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. It was great. And I'm looking around Diane's head, so I get now I can see you. You mentioned developmental mechanisms in cognitive frameworks that are affecting religious expression and experience. And I'm interested to know if you all, in a certain sense, are touching some of that by the fact that you worked with student-aged persons, or perhaps in your own field work also, or looking at younger expressions. Was it younger persons who were possessed did you see in your field work the kind of shaping of understanding of possession in a kind of developmental sequence, as our cognitive capacities also seem to come in developmental sequences, and there are teachers who bring you along. And the effects of that, certainly in the practices I study, contemplative practices, that notion of a teacher developing one's skills and cognitive capacities is a very important aspect. And since you mentioned developmental mechanisms, I just wondered if you'd begun to work with that or think of that in your own research.
It's another excellent, an excellent point, and something I would desperately like to do some research on, but I really couldn't do very much on it because there were, I mean, in terms of the mechanisms which I think underpin the basic conceptualization of possession, so the notion of agent, so the ability to detect agency, once you've detected what, you know, the difference between an agent and an object, what might be driving that agent's behaviors and so on. These come online, you know, very, very early in development, and so there is a lot of developmental research on this. And of course there are more mechanisms than that, some more sophisticated social cognitive mechanisms and so on about tracking who's who and who's in whose body, and that might come on a little bit later and even be difficult for adults to track. All of this, I don't really have a sense in how this then maps out in terms of how people learn about possession in the possession cult context, because I didn't have much access to children at all. I worked in one main cult house where there was one very small child who attended every so often, and then a few teenagers really, but nothing in between to kind of get that sequence. But I think it would be really important to do that, and in fact I do want to add another sort of strand to my research made that on kind of mind-body reasoning, intuitive mind-body reasoning, developmentally. I'm kind of doing the adult stuff first to get through some of the sort of teething problems with that before I then take it to the children, a much simpler version. I think, you know, Justin, in terms of the contribution of developmental psychology to cognitive science of religion in particular, well, Justin Barrett here is a developmental psychologist by training and has done a lot of research on children's developing understandings of gods, so kind of gods and gods, sort of high God concepts as well. So we're drawing from research in developmental psychology. We're trying to map that onto how children come to acquire belief in supernatural. I haven't got too far on how they come then to sort of explain their own God experiences and so on. As far as I know, that's a bit of a gap in the research. But again, an excellent point, and we need some more data on this. Thank you.
Go ahead, and the camera will...
Sorry, yes, and sorry, I was actually raising my hand in response to the previous question here, so I'm sorry to take a step back here. But I just wanted to amplify Professor Stewart's words of hope there for what this kind of research can offer us. Particularly, I was thinking of the way that this field is offering all kinds of new information that's expanding and changing a number of different debates that we've had. I'm thinking of a particular one that people are touching upon here, this sort of universalist versus tradition-specific nature of religious experience debate that has been going on for quite some time. And some of the research that's happening now, I think, is kind of exciting in what it offers us, because it allows us to look at these problems at a new level, at a new resolution that may change everybody's understanding on each side of the divide. An example would be that if we have brain scans of Buddhist monks and Franciscan nuns and atheists, all of which actually show us that they have some slight differences in brain activation in their verbal or visual areas if they happen to be visualizing or vocalizing to achieve their ecstatic state, but that they have the same activation in the orbital frontal cortex and the thalamic areas, and they go offline in their parietal lobe, which is what orients their bodies in space. We end up saying, okay, there is some common core that we can have there. We also have things happening now, if you've got confirmatory factor analyses of major measures of religious experience that are showing the same factors come out cross-culturally in different languages and within different religions, we can say that actually we do have some new information that we can debate rather than simply having truth or our best provisional understanding to the moment determined by the force of our own rhetoric. A few years ago, I actually gave a talk at the American Academy of Religion in the session after Ninian Smart took on Stephen Katz and Robert Gamello and Janet Jatso about precisely this question. And, and it was really tense. And it really was different levels of analysis. And I wish we had this information now. I started off my talk having just gone from the history of religions and trying to move into psychology, saying, that as a psychologist, I was absolutely required to take the Smart position on that issue. And Ninian Smart, defended that one for us pretty well. But I think that what's interesting is that we can have, a discussion now with new information rather than just old ideologies.
Thank you. Thank you. And I agree, of course. Yeah, with the qualifier that, it may not solve all our problems, it may not help us understand everything, and as Professor Stewart has already said, every aspect of the religion that she's studying, but it might help us tease apart some of the factors that are underpinning some aspects of religious experience. And in response to the universal thing, I think sometimes drives me to look for what's universal about cognition is simply the question that if we find something that's recurrent cross-culturally, like Tyler did apparently with the soul concept and the eliciting conditions for that particular idea, then it almost seems that with all the information we have now about how minds work, how human minds work, where these ideas come from, in other words, that we look to see, is there something about the way human minds are set up that contributes to the emergence of that idea? So not just looking to see the learning context and the social context, although not excluding those. So those, that's what drives me to incorporate this perspective into my own work. It's the questions that drive it. It's the questions that drive the incorporation of new methodological tools and new conceptual tools.
I've been sort of monitoring this, and the question and answer exchanges are taking about 4 or 5 minutes to do the question and the response. We've actually only got about a minute left in our time for this session, so I suppose the question now is, does anybody have a really short, easy question? Okay.
I was curious. Can I? Oh,
sure.
I was curious, and I'm sure Dr. Cohen talks about it in her book, but were you self-aware of how you were understanding spirit possession phenomenon as you were observing it in Belém? Were you aware of whether you were leaning toward displacement ideas of possession, spirit possession, or maybe fusion ideas or other ideas during the course of the research?
It's going to take me about 30 minutes to answer, so I'm only kidding. Again, a great question, and I haven't actually reflected on this at length. I've wondered about how, when I would ask people, a really obvious question to me at the time because of my interests, my theoretical interest was to try and figure out how much people remembered about their possession experiences. And they invariably told me that they remembered nothing, although there is this category of spirit medium that goes into a kind of semi-trance, and so they remember some things. But my participants told me that they remembered nothing. And I think I then deduced from that, in a way, that they weren't around in any sort of conscious way, observing their behaviors and so on, and certainly didn't have control over their behaviors. So I think it followed from that. But then I was, confronted with this alternative idea of what goes on in possession, that spirits, don't displace and that they fuse and so on, because I talked a lot with the cult house leader. And that's what he taught me. But then when I went around and sort of it wasn't just direct asking as well, it was kind of listening to people reporting about so-and-so who was possessed and did such and such a thing, and they were complaining about their behavior and thought it was inappropriate or something. And just various kinds of stories and the ways in which people would talk about different possession episodes that suggested that they were operating with a displacement assumption. There were some qualifiers to that I have another chapter about in my book about how people observe possession, but certainly in the abstract, in how people understand spirits and bodies and so on, it seemed that they operated with a displacement concept, as I've suggested. So I think all these things, and possibly my own mind-body notions and intuitive notions about how these relate, were influencing. But once I kind of got hold of these different ideas floating around in that context, and realized that one seemed to be more prevalent than the other. I was much more alert to the various kinds of factors that might be in play, and that's what drove the subsequent research. So, thank you.
Very good. Thank you.